There is a particular danger that comes with inherited wealth when money replaces independence instead of enabling it. In the pastor family of Monaco, generosity did not create security. It created dependence so deep that survival became tied to the continued existence of one woman. Helene Pastor was not only one of the richest people in Monaco. She was the axis around which an entire family's financial reality revolved. As long as she lived, the system held. The moment her life became negotiable, the system turned lethal. The pastor fortune did not begin in salons or boardrooms. It began in dust, stone, and desperation. Giovanni Battista Pastor arrived in Monaco in the late 19th century as a penniless Italian stonemason, his body already damaged by years of mine labor. He understood scarcity, and that understanding shaped everything that followed. His descendants did not merely build buildings. They built control. By the mid-20th century, the Pastor family had perfected a model that was brutally effective. Construct luxury properties. Never sell them. Rent them forever. In a country with almost no land and endless demand, this strategy created an empire that could not be challenged. By the time Helene Pastor inherited the core of that empire, the family controlled thousands of apartments and offices, representing a staggering portion of Monaco's total real estate. She was known as the Principality's shadow royalty, a woman whose power rivaled the ruling family itself. Yet behind that power was a private decision that would quietly undermine everything. She chose to provide her children with unlimited financial support, not as a safety net, but as a permanent condition of life. Each of her 2 children received approximately €500,000 every month. Enough to remove any need to work. Enough to ensure comfort, status, and indulgence. But also enough to prevent the development of independence. Over time, money stopped being a gift. It became oxygen. Without it, there was no life as they knew it. And oxygen controlled by a single person becomes leverage. This environment was not dangerous on its own. It became dangerous when it attracted someone who understood the system better than the family did. Someone who recognized that in a structure built on allowances, inheritance was not a distant event. It was the decisive moment. For Wojciech Janowski, the man who would later marry Helene Pastor's daughter, the family fortune was not just wealth. It was a mechanism to be exploited, studied, and eventually accelerated. Janowski did not arrive as a criminal. He arrived as a solution. Charming, attentive, and carefully constructed, he embedded himself into the family's daily life. He learned their habits, their tensions, their vulnerabilities. For nearly 3 decades, he observed a simple truth that no one else wanted to confront. As long as Helene Pastor lived, she controlled everything. And for someone drowning in lies, debts, and a fabricated identity, her continued existence was not protection. It was an obstacle. Wojciech Janowski did not exploit the Pastor family by accident. He exploited it because his entire adult life had been built on the careful manufacture of appearances. Born in post-war Poland, Janowski grew up in an environment where survival depended less on truth than on adaptability. Credentials could be invented. Histories could be rewritten. Proximity to power mattered more than legitimacy. These were not moral failures in his mind. They were skills. When he entered Monaco's elite circles in the 1980s, he arrived perfectly tailored for the environment. Monaco did not reward transparency. It rewarded confidence, titles, and the illusion of importance. Janowski presented himself as everything the principality respected. A Cambridge-educated businessman. A successful oil executive. A casino operator. A pioneer in advanced technologies. Even Poland's honorary consul to Monaco. None of it was real. But in a world that rarely checked, it did not need to be. Sylvia Pastor was vulnerable when he met her. She was in her 50s, emotionally bruised from a failed marriage, and living permanently in the shadow of a dominant mother whose authority extended far beyond money. Janowski understood this dynamic immediately. He positioned himself not as a rival to Hélène Pastor, but as a buffer. A man who listened. A man who appeared to offer emotional safety in a family structure defined by control and dependency. Their relationship lasted nearly 3 decades. Over those years, Janowski lived almost entirely on Sylvia's allowance, which itself flowed directly from Hélène Pastor. He never built an independent source of income. Every company he claimed to run existed only on paper, press releases, or carefully edited online profiles. Courts would later discover that many of his diplomas were purchased, not earned, and that his supposed businesses were shells used to absorb money and explain its disappearance. What made Janowski dangerous was not simply his dishonesty, but his patience. He did not rush. He allowed the system to sustain him while he slowly drained it. Millions of euros passed through Sylvia's accounts into ventures that never produced returns. Invoices were inflated. Assets were secretly placed in his name. Gifts were mortgaged without consent. Sylvia, insulated by wealth and accustomed to trusting those close to her, noticed too late how completely she had been financially hollowed out. By the early 2010s, Janowski's fictional empire began to collapse under its own weight. Creditors demanded payment. Legal actions accumulated. The persona he had spent decades constructing could no longer withstand scrutiny. At the same time, Sylvia received a cancer diagnosis. For most families, illness brings unity. In this case, it triggered calculation. The logic was merciless. If Sylvia died before her mother, the monthly allowance would stop immediately. Janowski would be exposed as a man with no income, no real assets, and a trail of financial misconduct behind him. If Hélène Pastor died first, Sylvia would inherit control of the empire, and Janowski's position would be secure. The problem was timing. Helene was 77, healthy, and still fully in control. According to testimony later presented in court, Janowski spoke openly about eliminating his mother-in-law shortly after Sylvia's diagnosis. He reframed the idea as necessity rather than crime. He portrayed Helene as psychologically abusive, as a tyrant whose death would liberate her daughter. Prosecutors would later dismantle this narrative, identifying it as retroactive justification designed to mask greed with moral language. Janowski did not act alone. He outsourced violence the same way he outsourced credibility. Through a personal trainer named Pascal Doriac, he connected with small-time criminals in southern France. These were not professional assassins. They were men from marginalized neighborhoods, attracted by promises of quick money. Their amateurism would ultimately expose the entire plot. The plan itself revealed Janowski's mindset. Kill both Hélène Pastor and her longtime chauffeur. Steal her handbag to simulate a robbery. Create chaos, not precision. He believed that wealth insulated him from consequence, that the enormity of the Pastor fortune would obscure the simplicity of the crime. It was a fatal miscalculation. The attack on Hélène Pastor did not unfold like a professional assassination. It unfolded like the collapse of a fantasy built by someone who believed money alone could substitute for competence. On the evening of May 6, 2014, Monaco experienced something it had not faced in modern memory, an open act of violence against one of its most powerful figures, carried out with startling clumsiness. Hélène Pastor followed a strict daily routine. That evening, she had visited the hospital where her son Gildo, weakened by a stroke, was receiving care. Her chauffeur, Mohammed Darwish, waited as he had for nearly 20 years. Darwish was not simply an employee. He was a constant presence in her life, a man she trusted completely. Together they left the hospital grounds in a black vehicle, turning into traffic as they had countless times before. Moments later, chaos erupted. A gunman emerged from behind concrete barriers and fired a shotgun directly into the passenger side window. The glass shattered instantly. Dozens of pellets tore through Hélène Pastor's face, neck, and torso. A second blast followed, striking both her and Darwish. The vehicle lurched forward before crashing to a stop. The attackers fled in confusion, abandoning any illusion of control. Witnesses described panic and disbelief. Surveillance cameras captured the perpetrators arriving and leaving by taxi, unable even to secure a scooter for escape. The entire operation bore the marks of desperation rather than professionalism. Within minutes, the scene was sealed. Doctors rushed to assist. Darwich was critically wounded. Helene Pastor lay motionless, her body devastated by the attack. Against expectations, she survived the initial assault. Surgeons performed emergency procedures, including a tracheotomy that left her unable to speak normally. Yet she remained conscious. When police officers later showed her photographs, she indicated that a man had approached and fired 2 shots. She asked to see investigators again, saying there were other things she needed to say. Those words would become a haunting refrain in the investigation. She never had the chance. Mohammed Darwich died 4 days later. His death underscored the cruelty of the plan. He was collateral damage, targeted not for who he was, but for where he sat. Helene Pastor survived him by only a short time. On May 21, she died from complications related to her wounds, taking with her the final opportunity to identify the person she may have already suspected. Monaco reacted with shock. Public statements expressed grief and solidarity. Black ribbons appeared across the principality. Initial theories focused outward. Organized crime. Italian syndicates. Russian interests seeking entry into Monaco's real estate market. The idea that the attack could originate from within the family itself was almost unthinkable. The evidence, however, pointed inward. Investigators followed a trail of financial transactions leading to Dubai, where significant sums had been withdrawn shortly before the attack. Phone records, taxi receipts, hotel surveillance, and DNA evidence accumulated rapidly. The hired gunmen were identified within days. Their mistakes had been extensive. A shower gel bottle left in a hotel room provided genetic material. Cell phones placed them at the scene. Payments connected them to intermediaries. Under questioning, the conspiracy unraveled. Pascal Doriac confessed quickly, revealing the structure of the plot and naming the person who financed it. His testimony connected the assassins directly to Wojciech Janowski. The image of the grieving partner collapsed. In its place emerged a man who had treated murder as a logistical problem, solved with money, incentives, and delegation. The revelation devastated the Pastor family. Sylvia Pastor was arrested along with Janowski, not as an architect, but as someone whose accounts had financed the crime. Her role became one of tragic proximity rather than intent. She would later testify to the total destruction of her life, describing the moment she realized the man she loved had orchestrated her mother's death in the name of saving her. The trial of Wojciech Janowski exposed far more than a murder plot. It revealed the anatomy of long-term deception, the psychology of entitlement, and the limits of wealth when confronted with evidence. What unfolded in the courtroom was not a mystery to be solved, but a slow dismantling of a man who had spent decades convincing others, and perhaps himself, that he was untouchable. Janowski entered court with the same confidence that had carried him through Monaco's elite circles for years. Impeccably dressed, controlled in posture, he framed himself as a victim of misunderstanding, police brutality, and betrayal. His defense strategy was consistent with his life pattern. When reality threatened him, he attempted to override it with performance. He denied ordering the killing. He denied financial desperation. He denied comprehension of police interrogations, claiming language barriers and coercion had produced false statements. The prosecution responded not with emotion, but with records. Bank transfers. Phone logs. Testimony. Surveillance footage. Most devastating of all, Janowski's own words. A video of his police interrogation was played in court. The tone was calm. The questions were clear. His French was fluent. In that recording, he acknowledged asking Pascal Doriac whether the problem with his mother-in-law could be resolved. The illusion of torture collapsed instantly. There was no ambiguity left to hide behind. Pascal Dauriac's testimony proved equally fatal. Unlike Janowski, Dauriac did not attempt to reinvent himself as a misunderstood intellectual. He described the plan plainly. Money was promised. Bonuses were discussed. Specific instructions were given. Kill both Helene Pastor and her chauffeur. Steal her handbag. Make it look random. The precision of these details stripped away any remaining doubt about intent. This was not panic. It was planning. Financial records completed the picture. Millions had flowed from Sylvia Pastor's accounts into Janowski's fabricated enterprises. Shortly before the assassination, withdrawals intensified. Payments moved through intermediaries and reached the hired gunman. The court concluded that the murder was financed using the victim's own money. This detail carried particular weight. It transformed the crime from betrayal into something closer to desecration. Sylvia Pastor's testimony marked the emotional center of the trial. Over several hours, she described the erosion of her life. The slow realization that her finances had been drained. The shock of discovering that the man she trusted had orchestrated the killing of her mother. She spoke not as a co-conspirator, but as someone who had been used as infrastructure for a crime she could not imagine. Her words reinforced the prosecution's view that Janowski's manipulation extended beyond money into the deepest layers of personal trust. The defense attempted one final inversion. Janowski's lawyer argued that love, not greed, motivated the crime. That Janowski acted to protect Sylvia from an allegedly abusive mother. The court rejected this narrative completely. Evidence showed no imminent threat. No coercion. No justification. What remained was a man facing financial collapse who chose murder as a solution. The verdict was unequivocal. Janowski was found guilty of ordering the assassination of Helene Pastor. He received a life sentence. The hired gunmen were also sentenced to life. Pascal Dauriac received a lengthy prison term for his role as intermediary. Appeals followed, accompanied by shifting confessions and renewed attempts at manipulation. Each was dismissed. In one of his final acts, Janowski attempted to redirect blame toward Helene Pastor's son, an accusation so baseless that even his own legal team recoiled. The court labeled it despicable. By then, the mask had fully disintegrated. What remained was not a master manipulator, but an aging man confined by the very system of accountability he believed wealth could neutralize. After the verdict, silence settled over the Pastor empire, but it was not the quiet of closure. It was the hollow stillness that follows irreversible loss. The court had delivered justice in legal terms, yet no sentence could repair what had been destroyed. Helene Pastor was gone. Mohammed Darwish was gone. And the family that once embodied continuity and control was left fractured beyond recognition. For Sylvia Pastor, life after the trial was defined by absence. She had lost her mother, her partner, and the illusion that love and loyalty could be separated from money. The wealth that once insulated her became a reminder of how thoroughly it had been used against her. She inherited power, but it arrived stripped of meaning. Every building bearing the Pastor name now carried a private weight, a constant reminder of the price paid for dependence mistaken as care. Gildo Pastor survived the physical damage of his stroke, but not the emotional aftermath. From his hospital bed, he had been unable to protect his mother or understand the forces closing in around her. During the trial, he attended daily, convinced from the beginning of Janowski's guilt. His presence was quiet, resolute, and marked by a sense of unfinished responsibility. He had inherited the empire without inheriting the unity that once made it functional. The Pastor properties continued to dominate Monaco's skyline. Rent continued to flow. The doctrine established generations earlier remained intact. Build, never sell, collect forever. In material terms, nothing had changed. Yet the meaning of that permanence had shifted. What once symbolized triumph now stood as evidence of isolation. Wealth endured, but it had failed to protect the human core it was meant to support. Monaco itself was forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. The principality had long cultivated an image of absolute safety, of problems solved quietly and order preserved through discretion. The assassination shattered that myth. This was not an external threat or an imported crime syndicate. It was a domestic implosion, driven by intimacy, proximity, and unchecked access to resources. The danger had come from inside the circle of trust. The case also exposed the fragility of inherited power when it is not paired with responsibility. Hélène Pastor had ruled her empire with precision, but she had underestimated the long-term effects of financial dependence. By removing the necessity for autonomy, she unintentionally created conditions in which control became resented and death became profitable. The tragedy was not only personal. It was structural. Wojciech Janowski would spend the rest of his life in prison, his titles stripped, his fabrications documented, his reputation reduced to a case study in greed. Yet even his punishment carried a bitter irony. He had spent decades pursuing wealth without labor, and in the end, his existence would be entirely funded by the state. The system he exploited ultimately sustained him in captivity, a final inversion of his life's logic. For those observing from a distance, the story of Hélène Pastor became a cautionary tale about old money and its illusions. The belief that wealth guarantees control. The assumption that loyalty can be purchased indefinitely. The confidence that status insulates against betrayal. Each of these assumptions collapsed under scrutiny. What remained was a stark truth. Money magnifies character, but it does not create it. The Pastor dynasty would continue in name, but not in spirit. Trust, once broken at that scale, does not regenerate. Relationships shaped by allowance and expectation cannot easily transform into partnerships based on equality and respect. The family survived as a legal entity, not as a unified force. The story of Hélène Pastor does not end with a verdict or a prison sentence. Its true conclusion lies in what the case revealed about power, legacy, and the quiet dangers embedded within dynastic wealth. Long after courtrooms emptied and headlines faded, the underlying questions remained unresolved, echoing far beyond Monaco's borders. At its core, the Pastor tragedy was not a failure of law enforcement or justice. It was a failure of structure. The empire functioned flawlessly as a financial machine, yet it failed as a human system. Wealth accumulated efficiently, predictably, and indefinitely. Responsibility, however, did not. Over generations, money became a substitute for purpose, and generosity became a mechanism of control rather than empowerment. The absence of independence was not accidental. It was built into the design. Hélène Pastor ruled her domain with discipline inherited from ancestors who understood scarcity. She trusted systems, contracts, and routine more than instinct. In business, this made her formidable. In family life, it left blind spots. She believed that constant provision equaled protection, that financial certainty would eliminate risk. Instead, it attracted it. When survival depends on one person's continued existence, that person becomes vulnerable in ways that security systems cannot prevent. The case also challenged the mythology surrounding inherited wealth. Old money is often portrayed as stable, restrained, and self-regulating. In reality, it can create environments where entitlement grows unchecked, shielded from accountability by layers of privilege. In such spaces, deception can thrive quietly. Janowski did not storm the gates of the Pastor empire. He was invited inside, slowly, politely, and permanently. His presence was normalized long before his intentions were questioned. Monaco itself serves as a critical backdrop to this lesson. The principality operates on proximity. Business, politics, and private life intersect constantly. Reputation carries immense weight, while scrutiny remains limited. In such an ecosystem, appearance often substitutes for verification. Titles, associations, and perceived prestige open doors that might remain closed elsewhere. Janowski understood this perfectly. He did not need to be legitimate. He only needed to look legitimate. The legal aftermath reinforced another uncomfortable truth. Justice can identify guilt, but it cannot restore trust. The Pastor family's relationships were irrevocably altered. Wealth remained, but cohesion vanished. The empire persisted as a collection of assets rather than a shared mission. What had once functioned as a dynasty dissolved into individuals managing inherited structures without inherited unity. For Sylvia Pastor, the consequences were particularly stark. She emerged from the trial alive, wealthy, and legally vindicated, yet emotionally devastated. Her life became defined not by what she possessed, but by what had been taken. Trust, safety, and the assumption of goodwill were permanently damaged. The man she loved had reduced her to an instrument. The mother who supported her had unknowingly created the conditions for her own death. The case forces a broader reflection on how power is transmitted across generations. Inherited wealth without corresponding responsibility can distort moral judgment. When access to resources is constant and unconditional, the boundary between need and desire erodes. In that vacuum, extreme decisions can begin to feel rational. Murder, in Janowski's logic, became an administrative act, a solution to a financial bottleneck. Helene Pastor's legacy, therefore, is not confined to Monaco's skyline. It extends into a cautionary narrative about control, dependence, and the human cost of systems designed solely for preservation. Her empire survived her, but it did not protect her. That contradiction defines the final lesson of the case. The assassination of Hélène Pastor endures not because of its brutality alone, but because of the clarity it offers. It strips away comforting myths about wealth, legacy, and control, revealing how easily power can corrode the bonds it claims to protect. In the end, this was not a story about Monaco's glamour, nor about a criminal mastermind undone by evidence. It was a story about dependence mistaken for love, and money mistaken for security. Hélène Pastor built an empire designed to last forever. Buildings rose, rents flowed, and the Pastor name became inseparable from Monaco's skyline. Yet permanence in stone did not translate into permanence in trust. The system that preserved wealth across generations failed to preserve human resilience. By insulating her children from necessity, Helene unintentionally removed the discipline that necessity teaches. Autonomy withered. Accountability blurred. And into that vacuum stepped someone who understood the equation better than anyone else. Wojciech Janowski did not invent greed, nor did he invent deception. What he exploited was a structure that allowed both to remain invisible for decades. He learned that in a world where allowances replace effort, timing replaces merit. In such a world, inheritance becomes a switch, not a transition. When the switch is controlled by a single life, that life becomes vulnerable in ways that security details cannot anticipate. The verdict closed the legal chapter, but it could not restore what was lost. Sylvia Pastor lived on with wealth intact and trust destroyed. Gildo Pastor carried the burden of survival without the comfort of unity. The family endured as a financial entity, but not as a moral one. The buildings remained. The bonds did not. For Monaco, the case punctured an illusion. The principality prides itself on discretion and order, on the belief that problems can be managed quietly behind closed doors. The Pastor assassination proved that silence can also conceal decay. When scrutiny yields to status, danger does not disappear. It simply waits. The broader lesson reaches far beyond one family or one city. Inherited power demands inherited responsibility. Without it, wealth amplifies the worst impulses it encounters. It rewards patience without integrity, confidence without substance, and proximity without loyalty. Over time, the line between protection and possession erodes, until relationships are measured not by trust, but by access. Hélène Pastor's final legacy is therefore paradoxical. She achieved what few ever do, she built something that outlived her. Yet in doing so, she revealed the cost of building systems that value continuity over character. Her death exposed a truth that money often obscures. No fortune is large enough to compensate for the absence of independence. And no empire is secure when its foundations are human weakness left unaddressed.